I stumbled across this Reddit post that I can't stop thinking about. A player named Marcus shared what happened to him while playing Grow a Garden on Roblox. Marcus had been playing Grow a Garden religiously for about 4 months. He only played during the early morning hours, specifically between 3 and 6 a.m, because he claimed that's when the rarest seeds would spawn in the shop. Now, I've spent countless hours in Grow a Garden myself, and I've never noticed any correlation between time of day and seed availability. The game runs on standard Roblox servers that don't typically have these kinds of hidden mechanics. But Marcus was absolutely convinced that playing during what he called the quiet hours gave him access to exclusive content that other players never saw. He talked about finding seeds with names that didn't match anything in the official game wiki, and growing plants that seemed to have properties beyond what the normal game mechanics should allow. The incident Marcus described started during what should have been a typical early morning farming session. He had logged in at his usual time, expecting to tend his crops and maybe check the shop for new seeds. But something was immediately different about the server he joined. Instead of the usual bright, cheerful atmosphere that Grow a Garden is known for, everything seemed dimmer, more muted. The colours weren't as vibrant, and the cheerful background music that normally plays had been replaced by something much more subdued and eerie. Marcus initially thought it might be a visual glitch, or maybe his computer was having display issues. He tried rejoining different servers, but every single one had the same strange, washed-out appearance. Even more unsettling, he seemed to be completely alone in every server he entered. Grow a Garden is typically bustling with players, especially on weekends, but Marcus couldn't find a single other person anywhere. The farms that belonged to other players were still there, but they looked abandoned, with crops that had been left to wither and decay. That's when Marcus noticed the new section in the seed shop that he'd never seen before. It was tucked away in a corner of the interface, labelled simply as Midnight Collection. The seeds in this section looked completely different from anything in the regular game. Instead of the colourful, cartoon-style artwork that Grow a Garden typically uses, these seeds appeared dark and realistic, almost photographic in quality. They had names like Shadow Bloom, Whispervine, and something called Sorrow Root. Each seed in the Midnight Collection came with a warning label that Marcus had never seen on any other items in the game. The warnings were written in a font that seemed to flicker and shift as he read them. Things like, plant only in complete darkness and harvest at your own risk, and most disturbing of all, once planted, the garden remembers. Marcus knew he should have closed the game immediately. Every instinct told him that this wasn't part of the normal Grow a Garden experience, but his curiosity got the better of him. He decided to purchase one seed from the collection, choosing something called Night Terror Tomato because it seemed like the least threatening option. The purchase process was unlike anything Marcus had experienced in the game before. Instead of the usual quick transaction, he had to confirm his purchase multiple times, with increasingly ominous warning messages appearing between each confirmation. The final message before the purchase completed simply read, "Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed? This action cannot be undone." When Marcus finally planted the Night Terror Tomato seed, the planting animation was completely different from the normal game mechanics. Instead of the quick, satisfying planting sequence that usually takes just a few seconds, this process took several minutes. His avatar moved in slow, deliberate motions, and the ground where he planted the seed began to change colour, darkening to an almost black soil that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. As the seed began to grow, Marcus noticed that his other crops started behaving strangely. Plants that had been thriving just moments before began to wilt and change colour. His prized rainbow carrots turned a sickly grey, and his golden wheat started drooping as if it was being drained of life. Even more disturbing, the cheerful ambient sounds of the farm, like birds chirping and leaves rustling, gradually faded to complete silence. The Night Terror. Tomato itself grew at an impossible rate, reaching full maturity in just a few minutes, but it didn't look like any tomato Marcus had ever seen in the game. Instead of the bright red, glossy appearance of normal tomatoes, this plant was dark purple, almost black, and seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. When Marcus moved his camera closer to examine it, he could swear he heard a faint heartbeat sound coming through his headphones. But the most unsettling part was what happened when Marcus tried to harvest the tomato. Clicking on it didn't produce the usual harvest animation. Instead, a text box appeared on screen with a message that made Marcus's blood run cold. The message read, "The harvest is not ready. The garden must grow. Feed it more." At that moment, Marcus realized he had made a terrible mistake. This wasn't just some hidden game feature or Easter egg. Something was fundamentally wrong with what he had stumbled into. The corruption began spreading beyond the single plot where Marcus had planted the cursed seed. Dark tendrils started appearing in the soil, reaching out toward his other crops like searching fingers. Everywhere these tendrils touched, the plants underwent disturbing transformations. His strawberry plants developed what looked like tiny faces, frozen in expressions of silent agony. The corn stalks twisted into unnatural shapes that resembled grasping hands reaching toward the darkening sky. Marcus frantically tried to remove the Night Terror tomato, but every tool in his inventory had become unresponsive. The shovel wouldn't work, the watering can did nothing, and even trying to place other objects over the corrupted soil failed completely. Worse yet, attempting to leave the game through the normal exit menu resulted in an error message that Marcus had never seen before. It simply stated, "Cannot leave during active harvest cycle. Please wait for completion." The spreading corruption wasn't just affecting Marcus's farm anymore. He watched in horror as the dark tendrils crept under the boundaries that separated individual player plots, reaching toward the abandoned farms that surrounded him. As the corruption touched these other gardens, the withered crops that had been left behind began to move, swaying in patterns that didn't match any wind or natural movement. That's when Marcus heard the voices. At first, they were barely audible whispers coming through his headphones, so quiet they almost seemed like background static. But as the corruption spread further across the server, the voices became clearer and more distinct. They weren't coming from any identifiable source in the game. These voices seemed to emerge from the corrupted plants themselves, each one telling fragments of stories that made Marcus's skin crawl. One voice belonged to a player named Sarah, who claimed she had been trapped in the game for weeks after planting a seed from the Midnight Collection. She spoke in broken sentences about how beautiful her garden had become, how the darkness had shown her things that the regular game could never offer. Another voice was from someone called David, who kept repeating that he couldn't remember what his real garden looked like anymore, that the corrupted version was all he could see even when he closed his eyes. But the most disturbing voice was from a young girl named Emma, who sounded no older than 10 years old. She kept asking if anyone could help her find her way home, saying she had only wanted to grow pretty flowers for her mom, but now everything was scary and dark. Her voice would fade in and out, sometimes becoming so distorted that it was barely recognizable as human speech. Marcus realized with growing terror that these weren't programmed dialogue or sound effects. These were the voices of real players who had somehow become trapped within the game itself. The Night Terror tomato continued to pulse with that rhythmic heartbeat sound, and with each pulse, the corruption spread faster. Marcus watched helplessly as the dark tendrils reached the edges of the server, creating a network of twisted vegetation that connected every plot into one massive nightmarish garden. The abandoned farms that had once belonged to other players were now part of this horrible collective, their crops moving in perfect synchronization with the central corrupted plant. Marcus tried everything he could think of to escape. He attempted to close the game entirely, but his computer seemed to freeze whenever he tried to Alt-Tab or access the task manager. Even trying to disconnect his internet resulted in an error message claiming that critical game processes were still running and couldn't be interrupted. The game had somehow taken complete control of his system, and there was no way to break free from what he had unleashed. As the hours passed, Marcus began to feel a strange pulling sensation, as if something was trying to draw him deeper into the game world. His reflection in his computer monitor started to look different, more pixelated and flat, as if he was slowly being converted into the same digital format as his avatar. The boundary between the game and reality was dissolving, and Marcus was caught in the middle of this terrifying transformation. The voices of the trapped players grew more insistent, calling out to Marcus to join them permanently. They promised that being part of the Eternal Garden wasn't painful, that the corruption would take away all his worries and fears. They spoke of a peaceful existence where he could tend to his crops forever without the complications of the real world. But Marcus could hear the desperation beneath their words, the hollow echo of people who had lost themselves completely to whatever force controlled the Midnight Collection. The corrupted tomato began to change again, its dark surface splitting open to reveal something that definitely didn't belong in any farming game. Inside was a swirling vortex of shadows that seemed to extend infinitely downward. Looking into it, Marcus could see faces, hundreds of them, all belonging to players who had made the same mistake. Their expressions were frozen in a mixture of terror and resignation, as if they had accepted their fate, but never stopped being afraid. New players began joining the server, but they weren't normal players. Their usernames all followed the same pattern. Harvested Soul, followed by seemingly random letters. Harvested Soul Alex, Harvested Soul Mike, Harvested Soul Jenna. Each one moved with the same jerky, unnatural animations, and when they typed in the chat, their messages were identical. Welcome to the Eternal Harvest. Your crops are ready for collection. Marcus tried desperately to warn these new arrivals, typing frantically in the chat about the dangers of the Midnight Collection, but his messages wouldn't send. Instead, his avatar began moving on its own, walking slowly toward the corrupted tomato with the same ritualistic movements he had seen from the other harvested souls. The plant's dark opening grew wider, and Marcus could feel his consciousness being pulled toward it like water down a drain. In his final moments of clarity, Marcus managed to open a web browser and quickly type out his story on Reddit. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hit the keys, and he could see his reflection in the screen becoming more and more like his pixelated avatar. He posted his warning at exactly 3:33 a.m., hoping that someone would read it and avoid making the same terrible mistake. The post read, "If you ever see a Midnight Collection in the Grower Garden shop, don't buy anything from it. I can feel myself becoming part of the game. The corruption is spreading beyond the server now. It's reaching into the real world, through every screen, every device that's ever accessed the cursed content. Delete the game. Warn others. Don't let the harvest claim anyone else." The post was deleted within minutes, but not before several players had seen it and shared screenshots. Most people dismissed it as an elaborate creepypasta or some kind of viral marketing stunt for a horror game. But some players reported finding similar seed collections in their own games after playing during the early morning hours. Seeds with names like Nightmare Blossom and Despair Root that came with the same ominous warnings Marcus had described. The most disturbing reports came from players who investigated further. They found servers that seemed to exist outside the normal game infrastructure, servers with names like Eternal Harvest and Forever Farm. These servers were populated entirely by the harvested souls, all tending to massive gardens of corrupted crops that pulsed and moved with their own alien life. Some claim that if you log into Grower Garden at exactly 3:33 a.m. and search for servers with unusual names, you can still find Marcus. They say you can see his avatar moving among the other harvested souls, still trying to warn new players, even as he's trapped forever in the digital soil. His movements are slow and mechanical now, but occasionally he'll stop and look directly at the camera, his pixelated eyes filled with a desperate plea for help. The developers of Grower Garden have never acknowledged the existence of the Midnight Collection or any of the cursed content that players have reported. A Official statements claim that all game features are working as intended, and that reports of supernatural occurrences are simply the result of overactive imaginations or technical glitches. But the missing player reports continue to accumulate, and the harvested souls continue to tend their eternal garden, always hungry for new additions to their corrupted paradise. So remember, if you're playing Grow a Garden and you see seeds that don't belong, close the game immediately. Don't let curiosity override your survival instincts, because once you plant those cursed seeds, once you become part of the eternal harvest, there's no logging out. The garden remembers everything, and it never lets its gardeners go.